Montana Territory, early spring of 1883. Snow still clung to the Blacktail Mountains, but the sun had begun to warm the valley floor when the woman with tired eyes stepped off the westbound stage in the town of Red Elk Hollow. She held a boy's hand in one of her own, a little girl cradled in the other arm. Both children were too quiet for their age. The boy looked around like he expected someone to come chasing after them. The girl had tear-streaked cheeks and a blank stare that did not match her 3 years. The woman's name was Prudence Garvey. She was 27, and she carried more weight in her heart than in her satchel. The man who noticed her first was tying down sacks of grain to his packhorse near the mercantile. He paused when he saw her threadbare shawl, the way her shoes were scuffed raw at the toes, how she kept her chin lifted out of sheer pride though every muscle in her body looked ready to drop. He stepped forward, dusting his hands off on his trousers. "Ma'am," he offered gently, voice low, "you look like you could use a place to rest." She looked up at him, her mouth set like stone. "Do not need charity." "I was not offering it," he said, tipping his hat. "I was offering coffee. My fire's still burning. I keep it going most days. For folks who need it." The boy clung tighter to her skirt. The girl shifted in her arms. Prudence studied the man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and a quiet steadiness in his brown eyes. His shirt had been mended at the collar, and the boots on his feet were worn but polished. He looked like he earned everything he had with honest work. "What is your name?" she asked. "Faron Whitlow." "You a rancher?" "I run cattle up in the foothills. Got a small cabin by the creek. Enough space for 3 folks to sit in peace till you figure where you are headed." She hesitated. Then the girl in her arms whimpered, and the boy's stomach growled loud enough to hear. "All right," she said, her voice thin. "Just to warm up." Faron nodded. "This way." The cabin was half an hour's ride north of town. Faron saddled his second horse for her and helped the children up before swinging onto his own. The ride was mostly quiet, except for a few questions from the boy whose name was Jasper about wolves and bears and whether Faron had ever shot one. Once they reached the cabin, Faron opened the door and stepped back to let them in first. The inside was warm, clean, and smelled faintly of coffee and pine smoke. He had a fire going, just like he said good wood crackling in the stone hearth. She settled the children near the warmth, her hands shaking just a little as she unwrapped their coats. "I will make something filling for them," Faron said, already moving toward the cupboard. "Beans and cornbread, if that suits." She nodded. "Thank you." He cooked while she dozed lightly in the rocking chair, her head tilted back, the girl asleep in her lap. Jasper sat on the rug beside the fire, tracing the stitching in a worn quilt Faron had laid out for them. When they ate like they had not touched food in days. Faron did not ask questions. Not then. He just poured her a second cup of coffee and handed it to her with a quiet, "You are safe here." That night, he gave up his bed for the children and slept on the floor by the hearth. She tried to protest, but he only said, "I will not have those little ones cold another night." By morning, she was still there, and by the second morning, she had folded their clothes and swept the floor before he came in from feeding the horses. "Where is their father?" he asked once, careful not to meet her eyes unless she let him. She looked out the window. "He left us in Kansas. Said he was going for work. Never came back. I waited months. Then I packed what I could and left." "Why here?" "My aunt was supposed to live in Red Elk Hollow, but she died last winter. Found out when I got off the stage." Faron nodded slowly. "You got nowhere else?" She shook her head. That night, after the children were asleep, she stood by the fire with her arms folded and said, "I do not expect you to keep us here. I know. I will find work. I can sew. I kept house for a boarding school once. I believe that." She turned toward him. You do not know me. I do not need to know everything to believe you do what you say. She swallowed hard. You are kind. I was raised by a mother who would slap me silly if I was not, he said with a small grin. She almost smiled, but it stopped halfway. The next week passed with a rhythm. Faron rode out early to check on his cattle. Prudence helped where she could, mending shirts, cooking meals, watching the children. Jasper followed Faron like a shadow, asking about horses and fences and wild things. The girl, Unia, stayed close to her mother, but her eyes grew a little brighter each day. One night, Faron came in from the cold, shaking snow from his coat. Prudence was by the fire, brushing Unia's hair. You are building something here, she said quietly, not looking up. Something solid. He crouched beside the hearth, held his hands out to the flames. Trying to. She hesitated, then said, I never had that. Not really. Not with my husband. It was always scattered. Always one step from falling apart. Faron looked over at her then, eyes steady. I do not have a ring, Prudence, he said, voice low. But I have a fire, and a future, and if you want it, you are welcome to both. She met his eyes and her breath caught. Her hand stilled in Unia's hair. I do not know how to trust much anymore, she whispered. You do not have to know yet, he said. You just have to stay long enough to find out. She looked down at Unia, then at Jasper, asleep on the rug with his hand against the dog's back. Then she looked at Faron. All right, she said, and the fire cracked softly between them. Late March settled into the valley with a restless wind that tugged at the eaves of the cabin and scattered needles from the pines. The snow softened but didn't vanish. Not yet. It lingered in shaded gullies and between the roots of trees, turning to slush where the sun hit long enough. Mud clung to boots and wagon wheels. Faron had to shift his cattle to higher ground where the moss had started to green. Prudence stood in the doorway that morning, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, watching Faron cinch the saddle on his gelding. Unia clung to her skirts, thumb tucked in her mouth. Jasper was already at the fence line, watching the smoke rise from the chimney of the small shed Faron used to cure meat. You mind if I take the wash down to the creek? She asked. He glanced back at her, pulling the strap tight. You're sure the trail's not too slick? I'll carry her, she said, shifting her daughter's weight on her hip. We'll be careful. He studied her face a moment. Bring the rifle, just in case. We'll be fine. Still, take it. She didn't argue further. He handed her the rifle before mounting up, then tipped his hat toward her without a word and rode off up the ridge. She watched until he disappeared between the trees, then turned to the baskets by the door. Unia helped carry a small bundle of cloth, toddling behind her mother as they made their way down the narrow trail that twisted through aspen and spruce. The creek was running high, its edges lined with melting frost, but the flat stones near the bend offered a dry patch wide enough to set the baskets. Prudence worked in silence, sleeves damp to the elbows. Her hands were red from the cold. Unia played at the water's edge, poking at smooth stones with a stick. A branch cracked somewhere across the bank. Prudence froze. She stood slowly, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the far slope. A mule deer stepped into view, ears high, then bolted at the sight of her. When she sat again, her breath left her in a long, shaking thread. She hadn't realized she'd been holding it. By the time they returned, the sun had climbed toward noon. Jasper ran to meet them halfway, cheeks flushed from the wind. There's a broken rail on the south fence, he announced. Faron showed me how to check it. He's gonna fix it tomorrow. She nodded, shifting the basket on her hip. That night, after supper, she stepped out onto the porch. The wind had quieted, stars sharp in the dark sky. Faron was stacking kindling near the woodpile, sleeves rolled, shirt damp with sweat. "You work too long," she said. He straightened, brushing sawdust from his hands. "Only way to stay ahead of the season." She leaned against the post. "I was 13 when I learned to sharpen a needle on a whetstone." Faron looked up at her, brows slightly raised. "There weren't money for new ones. My mother said a woman ought to know how to make do." She glanced toward the window where the firelight flickered behind the glass. "I reckon I've been making do ever since." He stepped closer, slow. "That ain't all you've been doing." Her eyes met his steady. "You're not afraid of what I carry, are you?" "What you carry made you strong," he said. "A man'd be blind not to see that." She looked down at her hands, the knuckles split from the cold, nails rimmed in soapstone and ash. "I haven't had a kind word said to me like that in years." "Then it's long past due." They stood in silence, the sky wheeling above them, coyotes calling faint in the distance. After a long moment, she said, "I don't know how to lean on anyone." "You don't have to lean," he said. "Just stand beside me." She stepped down from the porch, boots crunching frost. "Then show me how." He reached out, careful, hand closing gently over hers. No rush, no promise. Just warmth in the dark and the slow kindling of something unspoken but steady. Inside, the fire crackled. Jasper slept curled beside his sister, both of them breathing deep and even. The cabin was quiet, but it felt full now. The kind of full that didn't press or burden, just settled like a blanket laid over shoulders after a long road made colder by silence. Faron didn't let go of her hand, and she didn't step away. The thaw brought a restless sort of work. Faron spent longer hours on the range once the cattle began to wander for fresh shoots. The creek swelled with snowmelt, dragging branches and last year's bones downstream. Prudence kept to the cabin during those days, mending saddle cinches, boiling lye soap, keeping Jasper from wandering too far and Unia from scraping her knees on the porch planks. One afternoon, clouds piled up thick over the western ridge, and wind pushed down hard from the north. Faron returned earlier than usual, his coat damp, hat brim dripping. "There's weather coming," he said, hanging his rifle on the wall. "Fast." Prudence glanced out the window. "Do we need to bring the horses in?" "They're sheltered, but I'd feel better if the roof was braced." He didn't ask her to help, but she followed him out anyway, pulling her shawl tight. The sky was the color of lead, and the tops of the trees shifted like a sea. She steadied the ladder while he checked the beams. His boots scraped against the pitch of the roof, and she kept her eyes on his hands, watching how he moved with the kind of calm learned from years of doing hard things without complaint. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked, voice raised slightly over the wind. He looked down at her, crouched near the chimney. "I tried once, after my pa died. I made it halfway to Helena before I turned around." "What brought you back?" He secured the beam, then climbed down slow. "This land's not always kind, but it's honest. I'd rather live where things grow slow but deep." She touched the corner of the ladder, then looked up at the sky. "I never stayed anywhere longer than a season when I was a girl. You ran. We were always running from someone or something." She let the words settle. "My father drank up every place we ever lived." Faron didn't respond right away. He reached for the shed door and pulled out a coil of rope, hands sure. "Sometimes I think the only reason I kept going was because no one ever told me I could stop," she said, quieter now. Behind them, the wind dropped sudden, the stillness before a storm. "You stopped here," he said, tying the rope to a post. "For now." He turned toward her. "You've got the right to choose something lasting. I don't know what that looks like. It looks like Jasper learning to ride a horse that won't buck him. Like Unia sleeping through the night without crying once. Like you not checking the window every time the wind shifts." She looked at him, the lines at the corners of her eyes catching the dim light. "You see more than you say, don't you?" "I listen." Thunder cracked in the distance. He reached forward, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered a moment. "I won't ever keep you," he said, "but I'd be grateful if you stayed." She didn't answer, but she didn't step back either. That night the storm hit hard. Rain battered the roof, and the wind rattled the shutters. Unia cried once in her sleep, but Prudence was there before she could wake fully, humming low against her hair. Jasper curled tighter under the quilt, his hand tucked beneath the dog's neck. Faron sat near the fire, boots off, shirt sleeves rolled up, a thin scratch across his forearm from the roof bracing. Prudence pressed a damp cloth to it. "You always this stubborn about weather?" she asked. "Only when I have something worth protecting." She tied a strip of muslin around the scratch, snug but careful. "I used to think safety was a lie," she said. "A thing people said to each other so they could sleep easier. And now," she met his gaze, "now I think it might be a thing you build one piece at a time." He reached for her hand, his fingers tracing the line of her knuckles. "You've already built more than you know." Outside, the wind began to ease. Rain softened to a steady hush. Inside, the fire burned slow and steady, the kind meant to last through the night. By mid-April, green had begun to creep up the hills. The cottonwoods along the creek unfurled their leaves like slow promises, and the light no longer held that winter edge. Morning still bit at the fingers, but by noon the sun warmed the dirt road enough to stir dust beneath boots. Prudence stood outside the cabin with a pail of buttermilk, watching Jasper try to coax a calf back through the gate it had nosed open. Faron leaned against the fence, arms crossed, letting the boy figure it out before stepping in. "He's got a good hand," she said once the calf skittered back to its mother. "He's learning to listen to more than just noise," Faron replied. "That's the first step." She nodded, then looked toward the slope where wild onion grew thick beneath the trees. "I could take Unia out to gather some greens before supper, if you think it's safe." "There's a bobcat that's been nosing around the ridge," Faron said. "Took a hen from my neighbor's coop last week. If you go, take Jasper along and don't stay out past early afternoon." She gave a small nod, already planning what she'd cook if she found enough. "You think he'd rather do that than shadow you?" Faron watched the boy climb onto the fence rail. "He might. I think he's trying to prove something lately." She looked at him. "To you. Could be. Or maybe to himself." They were quiet a moment. Then she said, "I used to think I'd raise them in town, near other children. A schoolhouse. A church. There's a schoolhouse in Red Elk Hollow. Just need someone to open it regular again." She tilted her head. "It hasn't been used?" "Not much since the widow who taught there moved back east. Folks were too scattered to keep it going." She ran a thumb along the handle of the pail. "I taught letters once. Just children of the mine hands. They paid me in flour and lard." Faron didn't answer right away. Then he said, "You've got a voice that carries calm. I'd wager children listen to you more than they'd admit." She didn't smile, but something in her eyes softened. "That's not always been true." He turned toward her then, fully. "If you wanted to open that schoolhouse again, I'd help. Fix what needs fixing. Talk to the families around." She looked toward the tree line, where Unia sat in the shade with a twig in each hand, humming to herself. "You mean it? I wouldn't offer if I didn't." She swallowed. "I thought I was done with that part of myself." "You're not done," he said. "You're just changing shape." That evening, she set out cornbread and onion stew, and Jasper cleared the table without being asked. Faron came in late, carrying a satchel of nails and a folded paper he laid beside her plate. "What's this?" "Land record," he said, tugging off his boots. "Barn and cabin sit on my claim. But there's another parcel down by the willow stand. It's unused." She brushed her hand across the folded edge. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because there's a way we could make this permanent if you wanted it." Her voice was careful. "I thought you said you didn't have a ring." "I don't," he said. "But I've got lumber, and a foundation I poured with my own hands. I've got a fire that never goes out and a roof that doesn't leak. And I've got a future here. One I want to build with you." Her breath caught, but her face didn't change. "You're asking something big." "I know. What if I'm not ready to say yes?" "Then I'll wait," he said. "As long as it takes. You've known too many men who made promises to get what they wanted. I only intend to keep what's freely given." She looked down at the paper again, then stood, crossed the room, and opened the door. The night was clear, the moon caught in the black branches of the trees. She stepped out and stood there for a long moment, breathing slow. When she came back inside, she didn't speak. Just went to the hearth, knelt beside Unia's blanket, and tucked it tighter. Then she turned to Faron, her eyes steady. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to teach again. I want to plant something and see it grow." His voice was quiet. "With me. With you." He didn't move toward her. Just nodded once, that same quiet strength she'd come to know. She crossed the room and took his hand. Not as a question, as a beginning. May brought a quieter rhythm, one that settled deep into the soil and the bones. The snow had long since melted from the gullies, and the cottonwoods now stood in full leaf, their branches swaying with the soft weight of spring. The schoolhouse door creaked when Faron pried it open, hinges rusted from too many seasons untouched. Dust clung to the windows, and mouse droppings scattered across the warped floorboards. Prudence stood in the doorway with a basket balanced on her hip, Jasper just behind her holding a small broom that had once belonged to a mining camp cook. She didn't flinch at the smell or the sagging shelves. She stepped inside, set down her basket, and opened every window to the light. Faron watched her walk the space, her hand trailing the edge of a desk, her gaze moving across the chalkboard like she was reading words no one else could see. "It'll need new planks by the back wall," she said. "And the stove pipes rusted through. I'll bring tools tomorrow. Jasper can help nail boards if he minds his thumb. I'll keep him from bleeding on anything." Faron chuckled, but he didn't step inside. He stayed just outside the threshold, his shoulder against the frame, watching the way she moved with quiet certainty in a place most folks had long since given up on. That evening, after the children were asleep, Prudence sat on the porch with her sewing in her lap, though she wasn't stitching. The light had gone soft, and the fields were washed in gold, the kind that made everything look gentler than it was. Faron sat beside her, his hands resting on his knees. "I used to think a new start would look like a fresh house and clean paper," she said. "But it's more like this, isn't it? Peeling back old layers, finding what still holds." "It's not always pretty," he said. "No, but it's honest." They sat without speaking for a while, the air full of frog song from the creek. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "I wrote to the circuit preacher," she said. "Asked if he'd come through in June, for the schoolhouse dedication." Faron took the paper, glanced down at her careful script. "Was that all you asked him?" She turned toward him, eyes steady. "No. I asked if he'd marry us." He didn't answer right away, just looked at her the way he had that first morning, like he saw everything she carried and didn't flinch from any of it. "You sure?" he asked. "I wouldn't offer if I wasn't." He reached for her hand, rough against hers. "Then I reckon I'll shave for the occasion." She laughed, the sound soft but full. "I reckon I'll find a ribbon for Unia's hair." The preacher arrived with a mule cart and a crooked smile the second week of June. The neighbors came, most of them bringing something: canned peaches, cornbread, a fiddle. The schoolhouse stood with a fresh coat of whitewash, the stove replaced, the windows scrubbed until light poured through like river water. Prudence wore a dress sewn from old muslin curtains she'd found in the church's storage shed. Jasper stood tall beside Faron, his shirt tucked in, his boots polished. Unia clung to her mother's skirt until the preacher began to speak. There were no grand words, just vows spoken steady and true, hands clasped, eyes held. Then Faron leaned forward and kissed her. Not quick, not showy, just sure. The kind of kiss that said, "I'll carry your name like I carry my tools, with care and purpose." Afterward, they ate under the cottonwoods, and someone played a slow tune while Unia danced in her bare feet and Jasper chased fireflies with the neighbor's boy. Prudence sat beside Faron, her hand resting on his knee, her head against his shoulder. That night, when they returned home, the cabin felt changed. Not in shape but in weight. The air inside held something settled, something whole. Faron tucked the children into their bed while Prudence lit a lamp near the hearth. She turned when he stepped beside her, his hand reaching for hers. "I never thought I'd stand in a home that was mine," she said. "It's ours now." She looked at him, her eyes full, but not with tears, with something gentler, something earned. "Faron Whitlow," she said, fingers tightening around his. "You've given me more than safety. You've given me belonging." He leaned in, forehead to hers. "And you've given me a reason for every quiet morning and every long day." They stood like that for a long while, the fire dimming low, the wind brushing soft against the shutters. Years passed. The schoolhouse stayed open 5 days a week, rain or shine. Children from homesteads as far as 8 miles came on horseback or foot. Prudence taught them to read, to write steady, to speak with reason. She taught the girls to trust their minds and the boys to listen before acting. Faron built another shed, then a second corral. He hired a ranch hand one summer when the cattle count doubled, and still came home in time for supper, boots muddy but eyes warm. Jasper grew tall and quiet, like Faron, and took to carpentry. He built Unia a bookshelf when she turned 8, carved with flowers that matched the ones growing behind the house. Unia read every book in the schoolhouse by the time she was 12 and corrected her mother's handwriting without apology. And every evening, after the day had settled and the chickens were roosting and the firewood stacked, Faron and Prudence sat on their porch, shoulders touching, watching the sun dip behind the hills. They had no need for many words then. They had built a life, not perfect, but true, and they never let go of each other, not once.